Welcome to the Super Gamer Podcast. Welcome to the new Super Gamer Podcast. Our guest this week is an assistant professor at Ohio State University, director of the Kronos Laboratory, PhD in mass communication with research focusing on emotion in video games and how virtual environments convey social information that influences emotion, cognition, and behavior. We have Dr. Teresa Lynch. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So I actually got wise to you because of my mom, who messaged me. She knows I do this show, and she was like, oh, I was just watching a program, and it was about fear, and it brought up this study about video games and fear.
Yeah.
And sure enough, we went from there. So that's where I'll start. You have a study from, I believe the study you did in 2013, I think it was published 2015.
Yes.
You and Nicole Martins, you did Nothing to Fear, an analysis of college students' fear experiences with video games.
Yeah, that's right. And that was actually my master's thesis. And Dr. Martins, who is my advisor, helped me. That was the first study that I ever completed on my own. And it was really something that spoke to a lot of my personal interests and really was a launching point for a lot of my further theorizing and further work in that area. So, yeah, that was a fun study to do.
I laughed, actually. One of the games you did, the first game I think of when I think of fear, is Amnesia. And
Yes.
that was, of course, in this study. And the thing that made me laugh is because in the study you mentioned fight or flight. And in real life, I am 100% flight. Like, absolutely. And that is the only game I can think of that, like, really got me doing that. Like, without, as the game goes, you don't really see the monster at first, but the presence is kind of there. And I remember a specific moment where I just, like, hid in a closet.
Sure,
and
yeah.
it was purely just like, oh, what do? I have to get out of here.
Yeah, and the thing about Amnesia in particular is that Amnesia is a game that puts you in the position of being in the position of prey. I mean, you can't fight back against the monsters. All you really can do is hide from them. So that's a particularly interesting design characteristic that the developers employed there. So
yeah. You also mentioned that, and this is funny to me because I'm so flight, that the higher skilled, more frequent players don't scare as easily as the lower skilled players.
Which was actually something that I have now found to be not necessarily the case. So in the 2015 study, we found that skill was predictive of people having less fear overall, just in terms of their self-report. Now, an important part of the method that we used in that study was asking people about their experiences, sometimes a long time after the fact. So, we were using a survey methodology where we were asking people to kind of reflect on and recall these experiences. And in that study, we found that skill was predictive of lower fear experiences. And so that actually inspired what ultimately became my dissertation work, because I thought, well, people who have, this better handle on the game, they can use, the controls more effectively. They're basically going to be more prepared to be able to deal with the threats in the game. If we have this horror game where, you have these nightmare creatures running after you, if you're able to effectively get away from them or defend yourself against them, then that's going to make it to where you have less fear overall. And in my dissertation, I actually found the opposite of that when I was using an experimental method where I had people, in the lab, I had them playing. I actually used Amnesia because of the findings from that previous study. And what I found was that people who had higher levels of skill were actually more afraid than the people who had less skill.
I wonder if anything going into that, sorry to cut you off.
That's okay.
I wonder if anything about that is, like you say, it's a pretty unique, especially at the time, gameplay. Like, normally you're the predator, not the prey in video games. And I wonder if people are just like, I'm not used to this situation. Oh my goodness, I don't like it.
I think there may have been some of that, but I think what we found, so we actually measured another variable, and that variable is one that we call presence. And what we found was that presence fully mediated this relationship. And now what that means is that people who felt like they were physically present in the game environment, that they felt like they were there were experiencing greater levels of fear. And that makes sense, right? I mean, if you feel like what's going on in the content is really happening to you, then of course, if you've got nightmares, creatures coming after you that you can't defend yourself against, that's going to be really scary if you feel like that's more real. And what we found was that people who are higher in skill basically had that facilitated for them more easily. And now if we think about that and kind of unpack that, that also makes sense, because people who are sitting there fumbling with the controls, who might be, more concerned about how do I navigate this 3D environment? How do I, I don't know how to move my character in this virtual space. I don't know which buttons I'm supposed to press to be able to open a door to get away. They're sitting there thinking more or less about their, about their physical environment, the place where they're at, that's sitting in a lab. They're just not as into the experience. And that's one of the reasons why I think playing video games is a really interesting way to study these kinds of emotions and these kinds of emotional processes, because for people who have that level of skill, who can get into the game experience, they're going to experience heightened emotions compared to people, the things that are lower in skill, the things that are in the game that are basically evoking these kinds of emotional reactions are going to seem more real whenever you're able to attend to that content more. You're able to pay more attention to it and let the kind of the real world melt away.
And I guess along those lines, you found in Nothing to Fear that as interactivity increases, so does the potential for fear. So
Right.
What about, do you think VR is really going to take horror to a new level?
I mean, I definitely think that presents a lot of really interesting opportunities. And one of my colleagues who's working in this area, Matthias Clayson, and his team over in the Recreational Fear Lab over in Denmark, are really doing some cool work in this area. Thomas Terkelson is another person who's working in this area, who's really trying to see what we can do with VR and see how it can be leveraged to understand fear experiences. So I think that whole immersive element is really impactful. But I think there's, the thing is, I think there's a sweet spot for people, when it comes to fear experiences. I mean, there, as you mentioned, there are individual differences with respect to how much people want. And so I think for VR, I think that's going to be, that's going to really up the ante in terms of, what people can, what people are experiencing, and it's going to potentially put people in a zone where they're just too overwhelmed by the experience, and that might not be an entertainment fear experience that they would desire. So I think that potential is really high, but I think as far as thinking about it as this entertainment experience, I think there's definitely sort of a Goldilocks zone with respect to what people want, and that's going to differ between different people.
Right. So it's that sweet spot between, like, a game is more interactive and so maybe more fearful or more enjoyable fear than say watching a scary movie, but it's also less than say entering a haunted house.
Sure. And that's actually where Matthias and his team have been doing some work, is thinking about these kinds of interactive haunts, and thinking about haunted houses and that kind of thing. And I think that if we put this on a, kind of a continuum from, the least interactive to the most interactive, I mean, certainly in a haunted house and that kind of thing, you have that potential where somebody can physically reach out and touch you, right? I mean, and that is such an immersive experience that a lot of people, can't do that or would not be interested in exposing themselves to that kind of content. On the other end of the spectrum, we have, as you mentioned, these really low interactivity contexts where, the only interaction that we're really having is like our eyes taking in the information and our ears taking in the sound, and processing that information in a film or in a horror show, but we can't react to it or respond to it. And that, to me, is one of the things that makes video games so compelling as a place to study these kinds of emotional experiences, is that emotion serves a function for us. It basically invigorates our ability to respond to threats and opportunities in our environment. And so because we're, able to actually respond, in a video game environment, that offers the full opportunity to observe the cascade of emotion to behavior. So in a film, you might be wishing that somebody on screen, doesn't go into the next room because that's where the monster or the killer or the horror, situation is. And we as the audience know that. In the video game, you're actually making that decision to go forward, and then you have to respond to it. And you're actually given the ability, again, more or less, I mean, with amnesia kind of constraining what you can do in response to the threats, but you're still able to respond to the threat in a way that you wouldn't if it was a less interactive medium.
Right. I was going to say, when I was researching for you, I was going to say I'm surprised that zombies are so often mentioned as a source of fear in games, like in Call of Duty Zombies or whatever. Sure. Like, I get that they're a staple of horror, but they're not realistic. They're not really psychological. But then I kind of caught myself, because I've always found in movies, I find slow-moving zombies very scary, because they are kind of psychological. They're so helpless, but they're just everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, I think zombies are an interesting, an interesting fear stimulus just in and of themselves, and all the different ways that we've seen them portrayed across different media franchises, throughout history. Really is really kind of neat to think about, because zombies in particular, we have a lot of different kinds of threat stimuli kind of packaged into one creature, right? You have, not only are they dangerous and they're posing immediate threat to your well-being through, wanting to bite you and eat you and all of these kinds of things, but also the threat of contagion, the threat of, and then the existential threat of, what does this mean for humanity? What does this mean for my loved ones? So there's a lot of layers to me there, where we have kind of these biological imperatives that are sort of being cued, with respect to contagion and immediate threat of a predator. But then also we have, again, that higher level sort of rumination experience with zombies that can really kind of increase the way that we think about that. And then, of course, we've seen zombies portrayed so many different ways. And so, just as you mentioned, there are certain zombies that might be more fear-evoking for certain people or in certain contexts than others. And so so it's hard to say, too, whether the prominence of zombies in that particular study and the way that people were reporting that is just because they're so frequently invoked in the media content. We saw, around that time that study came out, The Walking Dead was really popular. A lot of media franchises were really capitalizing, Call of Duty Zombies certainly, on the prevalence of zombies and using them as a fear stimulus. But I think they have a lot of universal appeal as a fear stimulus because of those kind of biological imperatives that are implicated in the way that they scare us.
Mm-hmm. Switching gears here, and I'm sorry, I obviously can't go over all of your work, but I've picked out a few. But you do have lots. So, in 2016, Nicole Martins, Nicholas L. Matthews, and you. Yes. You had Real Ideal, investigating how ideal and hyper-ideal video game bodies affect men and women. You had that published in Computers in Human Behavior. And generally, the data provided evidence that hyper-idealized game characters negatively affected men, but positively affected women.
Yeah. Which
is interesting.
Yeah, and runs a little bit counter to what the popular narrative is about what seeing hyper-sexualized and hyper-idealized kinds of bodies on screen does to us, right? I mean, so, one thing I want to be careful about saying as I start talking about this area of work is that I do not want to suggest that, seeing or having a high prevalence of highly sexually objectified female characters in games is in any way a positive thing. One of the things that's, I think, an implication of my work in this area is that this is still a very complicated area to be understanding. So when we see this difference between men and women in terms of the way that they're impacted by the presence of a sexualized avatar in their virtual environment, and they're taking on that role, one of the things that my work has been arguing for is that the avatar is a distinct kind of character in media. It's not somebody that we're watching. It's somebody that we are becoming. They are incorporating into a part of ourselves. And I think this is distinguished with respect to skill. And skill is one of the variables that really kind of connects a lot of my work, because it differentiates the nature of the experience that you can have with a video game. And that doesn't mean that you can't have a really rich and robust experience with a video game if you're not a really talented player, a really experienced player. But the way that a lot of games demand that skill from you to be able to effectively process the content means that you would probably have a different experience if it was a game that you were playing for the first time and you'd never had that kind of experience before compared to another individual. So one of the things that we have found in that study and in several other studies experimentally is that, this consistent effect that's found in the sexual objectification literature with respect to media effects is not really holding up with video games. So the typical effect that we see is that when women are shown sexualized images of other women, they tend to feel worse about their bodies. They tend to feel less efficacy. They tend to feel less self-esteem. They tend to have more body dissatisfaction. And the general argument goes that it's because they're comparing their bodies and recognizing that they can't live up to this sort of socialized expectation of what beauty looks like, this beauty standard. And in video games, it's a little bit different. The relationship between the character and the person is a little bit different because you're not just looking at that character, you're becoming that character. And so in that way, you might be extending yourself into a character or merging your identity with a character that actually aligns with an ideal and makes you feel like you're moving towards that ideal, like you're matching with that ideal a bit more. And so that's what some of the arguments that I've made in my work, basically advance, is that we are seeing these kinds of effects because, people are still socialized to think of that kind of standard, that sexy, slender, curvaceous, kind of ideal, very Eurocentric features, these kinds of things as what they should look like. And when you feel like you are that as an avatar, that makes you feel better about yourself. Now, the problem with that is that is still a highly limiting representation of what attractiveness and beauty are. And so that's why I say I don't interpret that as necessarily a positive kind of thing. And sometimes that has been taken a little out of context in my work. One of the other things that we often find, so I have a content analysis, which is basically a systematic way that we look at the representations of different kinds of media content across different titles, or there are different kind of sampling strategies that you might use. But in some of my work, I do these very large scale content analyses where I'm looking at hundreds and hundreds of video games and trying to determine patterns of representation. And another thing that's a little bit different is that in video games, we tend to see the representations of women who are sexualized being combined with representations of them as highly powerful. And in a lot of other media contexts, you see sexy women being objectified. They're being put into positions where their background ornamentation, Feminist Frequency, Anita Sarkeesian, and folks like that have talked a lot about how, that kind of representation and that pairing of, ornamentation of women is problematic. And I agree with that kind of statement. But very often in video games, we actually see the opposite of that. We see that, these female characters who are highly sexualized are very powerful. They're very agentic. They are, often, put into positions of power. And so, when you're taking on the role of that kind of protagonist, there doesn't seem to be an immediate downside to it, aside from internalizing and continuing to sort of be rewarded with that very narrow view of what kind of appearance is acceptable.
Right. I was going to bring up that I had never heard of the Lara phenomenon, which is essentially what you just described, is that despite how sexualized a character can be, a strong, assertive, powerful female character is generally a positive reinforcement for female players. Did I get that right?
Yeah, and one of the things, so Jeroen Jans was the one who coined that term, the Lara phenomenon, and of course, relating it back to Tomb Raider's Lara Croft, and really thinking about the fact that in a lot of video games prior to Lara Croft's appearance, we didn't have these kind of prominent, powerful female characters who, stood on their own and that kind of thing. And part of the Lara phenomenon, the way they originally talk about it, it's not premised on the idea of being sexy. It's not premised on the idea that these characters are, attractive. But their argument is that, the prominence of the character, the power of the characters sort of overrides the sexual objectification that, other forms of media don't necessarily have the ability to do. Now, of course, we see, the femme fatale, and we have many, action heroes that, that are highly sexualized, throughout history, and that's part of their allure and their appeal. But in video games, you're not just looking at that character, you're becoming that character. And the way that can shift your self-concept, the way that shifts how you feel about what you actually look like, who you actually are, is the subject of a lot of my ongoing work right now.
Similar to the amnesia thing with the Nothing to Fear article, I had a bit of a laugh when the second I started reading, hyper-idealized, exaggerated body types, my mind went, Dead or Alive. And sure enough, that's one of the games you use to represent that.
Yeah, that's an easy one. And some of my other work, too, has started to try to tease out, this idea that we have context, within which these characters exist. So Dead or Alive is a really good example of, if the Dead or Alive series had only ever been beach volleyball and not had been the fighting game, then maybe having all of these scantily clad, bikini clad characters would have been okay. I mean, I think there are a lot of other critiques about this particular series with the boob physics and all of these kinds of things that we could levy, and I think those are understandably understandable critiques to make. But one of the things that I try, because I'm a gamer and I like playing games, and I'm critical of any kind of media that I engage with, whether that's games or film or social media or anything. But I think one of the things that's really interesting to think about with games is that we do still have context for these characters and their representations, and it's really hard in an empirical sense and in a social scientific sense where we're trying to generalize arguments, we're trying to find patterns at scale, to say that all of these representations are problematic, of female characters looking a certain way, because sometimes it makes sense that they look that way. If you have a character that's in a bikini and it's because she's in a volleyball simulator, that's not necessarily sexualized. Now, I'm not saying that the Dead or Alive characters are not sexualized. Certainly, I think that's the entire crux of that series. But, in some games, it might make sense for a character to be in a bikini or to be in a bathing suit or to look a certain way. But in the vast majority of these games, and what my work is showing, is that, we have more characters like Quiet from Metal Gear Solid, who, is wearing a bikini in a war zone, and there's some kind of tacked on narrative to kind of suggest why she should look that way. And it's not a very compelling case that the developers have offered in some of these situations. So we have been trying to come up with new ways to measure these kinds of representations and to think about and to do our legwork to understand, when we might call a particular representation problematic and when a particular representation might make sense given the context of the character's story.
So in a study like this, and in the Nothing to Fear study, presumably respondents, they're people, they know they're being surveyed. Is it a concern that when people answer, there's naturally going to be a sort of I better give something insightful?
Sure.
Does that make sense? How do you get around that?
Yeah. So, that's just a concern in doing social science research generally. One concern, we have a concern that we try to deal with called, demand characteristics, where the participants generally know what the nature of the study is, and they know what we're trying to get them to answer. So we use, or how we're wanting them to answer, I should say. And then, of course, there's, just the desire to, answer questions in a way that's, normative and socially appropriate. And it's difficult to ask people sometimes these questions because of those things. So that's definitely top of mind. So there are a variety of techniques that social scientists use to kind of get around that. And one that I think often gets on participants' nerves in studies is they're like, hey, you asked me this question like 7 times. Why did you ask me this question so many times? Well, because we're actually going to take all of your responses and look to see if you're consistent in the way that you're responding, because if you're not, then it may be the case that you're either motivated to respond in a certain way, and that kind of teases out some of those issues, of responding in a socially desirable way, or it may be that you're not paying attention to our study, and you're not answering these questions genuinely. So we have a variety of techniques that we use, in terms of the actual measurement that we use. One way that I try to get around that too in my work is that I often start with more qualitative methods. So actually going and interviewing participants and talking with them about their experiences, and not necessarily framing it as a, how do you feel about this on a 1 to 7 scale, but, can you elaborate your feelings about this kind of, content and why it might make you feel a certain way, or, those kinds of things. And to some extent, those social desirability characteristics are sometimes the subject of the work. So in some of my work, I'm actually kind of combining my gender interest and my emotion interest by thinking about differences in the way that, more feminine and more masculine sorts of socialization patterns might influence the way we talk about our emotions. And so, if then I find differences between, say, someone who I self-identifies as a man and someone who self-identifies as a woman and someone who self-identifies as non-binary, that's kind of an interesting finding in and of itself. So we're definitely savvy to that. We're definitely thinking about that as we're designing these studies, and trying, to counter that when we need to, or capture that when we need to.
In a different study of yours, but along the same lines, your research shows that female gaming characters are growing in number and hyper-sexualization is going down. Does it feel that way?
I think this is a curious finding, and I think there are two explanations for it. One is that I think that the industry is maturing and responding to the call for more diverse female characters. And this kind of harkens back to my point earlier that, I'm not trying to say that characters should look any particular way. I think there's nothing wrong with, there being sexualized characters, but the problem is when we only see one kind of body represented on screen, and that body tends to be a very young, lean, curvaceous, white female character. That tends to be the way that they're represented. And when we see only that kind of representation, that to me is when we have a problem, because it's limiting. We just, it's not that we can't have a character who looks like that or some characters that look like that, but it behooves the entire community of gamers and developers when we have more creativity in the way that characters are represented. And that goes for male characters too. The one thing is that I think we're seeing more diversity in terms of the way that characters are represented today. We have more characters that are kind of breaking away from that mold. I mean, Aloy from Horizon Zero Dawn is just a recent example that comes to mind. But the other thing is just the fact that we have more female characters is going to naturally increase the diversity with which their bodies are represented on screen. And so, that I think is part, I think more than it being that it's this social change that we're seeing, the industry mature, respond to feminist critique. I think that those things are happening, but I think it's also twofold. I think it also has that element of, just there being more female characters. We're seeing women's stories more centrally represented. And as a consequence of that, we're going to see more diversity in the representations of those characters, along with then, this kind of third component that is a thriving independent development sector, where we're seeing a lot of people who are representing stories that are not as mainstream. And so there are absolutely still a lot of gratuitously sexualized female characters, and gratuitously sexualized male characters on screen. But I think that we're also starting to see more diversity represented, and I don't necessarily mean diversity just in terms of race and ethnicity and age and ability and these kinds of things, but also just diversity in terms of the types of characters and the types of stories that are being told.
It's interesting to go around the internet and see how different media outlets portrayed this study. Most go with evidently what I did, which is hyper-sexualization is becoming less frequent. But the Wrap's headline was "Video games still overly sexualize female characters, study finds," which is probably the right way to go.
Yeah, it's the study, the 2015 study found that there was a decrease in sexualization. I mean, and that's a statistically significant decline. So that is accurate to say that there has been less sexualization recently that is matched with just the increase in female characters generally, that there are more of them. And so we don't see, not every character looks like Ivy from Soul Calibur, right? I mean, not every character looks like the female characters in the Mortal Kombat series, right? And fighting games tend to be the worst. My studies have shown that fighting games tend to be the worst perpetrators of sexually objectifying female characters. But there it's also the case that there are still problematic trends with respect to the way that female characters are portrayed. So, for instance, female characters that are secondary, so not the primary characters, not the heroes of their storylines, but these secondary characters tend to be more sexualized than primary characters. Now, why is that a problem? Well, secondary characters tend to have more emphasis on primary characters tend to have more emphasis on their unique characteristics as an individual. We tend to know more about them, their backstories, their feelings, their interactions with other characters. We hear them speak a lot. We hear their thoughts. We watch them drive the narrative forward. So they're very individuated. They have a lot of characteristics that make them more of a person to us. Secondary characters we don't have as much interaction with them to see their feelings, to hear their thoughts, to watch them drive the narrative forward. And as a consequence of that, it falls a little bit more in line with what we would think of as those kind of typically objectifying representations in less interactive media. So, having a background character who's primarily there because she's sexy is not potentially as empowering as having a character who happens to be sexy but is also, a brilliant scientist who is discovering all of these, ways to save the world. So, again, it's a little bit of the point isn't quite straightforward, and so sometimes that doesn't get picked up whenever media representatives are covering my work, and that can be a little frustrating for me, and I don't have the opportunity to kind of explain actually it's still more complicated than that. It's not just a good story, but I think people kind of take what confirms their pre-existing attitudes and beliefs on a lot of these kinds of things.
Right. So you originally, before you got into this world of research, you originally wanted to write music for games.
Yes.
Is that still a goal of yours?
So I actually have scored a couple of indie games, just for fun, and prior to my life becoming faculty at a R1, research institution, which is, keeping me a little too busy right now to be able to do that. But I have a bachelor's degree in music. I was an active music performer, and just had really solid background in music composition, from my bachelor's experience, and worked with some really tremendous mentors down in Savannah, Georgia, where I'm originally from. It turned out that getting a PhD and studying video games from a social science perspective was a little bit more straightforward than getting than getting into the industry as a composer. So I'm not aspiring to do that professionally anymore, but I definitely still love playing music and writing when I have a chance. But that's definitely much more of a hobby now. Although I do find that my experience does help me sometimes with designing stimulus material for studies and approaching some of the questions that I have, especially as they relate to emotion.
That might be the first time I've ever heard there are more job opportunities in academia.
Yeah, I don't know if I want to be quoted on that.
What are some of your favorite game soundtracks?
Oh gosh. Well, my favorite game composer is Yasunori Mitsuda. So the Chrono Cross, Chrono Trigger series, he's definitely one of my favorites. Lots of the JRPGs, so the games, the Final Fantasy games, and Nobuo Uematsu's music, definitely highly impactful. In fact, when I got married, a lot of my music at my wedding was from video games. The Halo series, I mean, Martin O'Donnell, and some of the music that he did, just phenomenal. But I guess those are some of the highlights.
And then before I get to the last research article I want to talk about, Heretic or Doom?
Heretic. 100%. although I played both. Yeah.
And they're both the same engine, but
yeah. Well, and Heretic I think just appealed a little bit more to my kind of Lord of the Rings sort of appeal. The things that were appealing to me than Doom. Although I think these days I might have picked up more on Doom, but I started gaming very young, and our very first PC we had Doom, and then we got Heretic, and I played both, but I would have said Heretic. Yeah.
It's interesting you had Doom first, because I saw you had written, you have a tweet saying that it's one of the games that really solidified, got you into gaming. Heretic, that being.
Yes.
But it's interesting that you actually played Doom first, because I certainly would have thought, oh, well, you played that one, and that obviously is what resonated.
Yeah, so my grandmother was actually the one who got me really into gaming, and it was because she had a Nintendo, an original NES. My dad had an Atari, and so we would play some of the more simple games from that time period. But the first game that I ever got into really played on my own and with intensity was Heretic. But we had Doom first, and I think I grew up with brothers, and my dad was the primary gamer, and I think Doom just kind of had that, corner on the male player at the time. I think the way that games were marketed, Jess Morris on Twitter has done a lot of conversations about kind of the gendered history of the way that gaming advertisements and magazines and that kind of thing sort of locked in the young male audience originally. And so we played a lot of Doom, so we had that one first, but then Heretic came not long after that for me, and that was the one where I just really dove in, and that was definitely a precursor to a lot of the kinds of games that I played early on.
So possibly your most recent published work, certainly one of the more recent, Discourse of Gaming, a conceptual framework of gaming as an interpretive community, from June 2022. Mm-hmm. You and Gregory P. Perot surveyed 427 adults on Reddit about gaming and violence and gaming issues. And it doesn't surprise me that respondents were kind of immediately on the defensive. They were expecting you to say, oh, look, gaming is bad for you with what you got from this.
Yeah. I mean, and as a gamer, as somebody who has one foot in both worlds, and is studying these kinds of things, I try to be sensitive to, approaching our participants with respect and not trying to frame them in a pathological way, right? I mean, because gaming, part of the rationale for doing this study and some of the follow-up work that we've done in this area, it has been that, gaming and gamers get a bad rap and are very often, scapegoated at large for the nature of, or for the assumptions around the way that gaming content affects people. And, there have been a lot of arguments that, gaming produces all of these kinds of harmful patterns of effects in society and this kind of thing. And I will say that I believe that gaming has an influence on us, right? You can't say that gaming has a positive effect and not acknowledge that it has a negative effect, and you can't do the opposite either. I mean, the gaming really is just part of our media ecosystem. If you're gaming and you're spending a lot of time with content, then it influences you in some way. I mean, you have emotional experiences, you have reactions to the content. Now, that doesn't mean that you go out and you enact things or you're mimicking things that you're seeing on screen. And so certainly, like, I don't subscribe to the idea that there are strong and powerful main effects of content, that if you play a shooter, you're going to become a shooter. Like, that to me is ridiculous. But there have been a lot of people who have used video games to push political agendas and who have used video games as, a scapegoat when, we don't want to talk about other kinds of pressing issues in society and problems in society. And naturally, as a gamer, I have experienced reactance to that. I have been like, hey, that is an unfair kind of statement to make about people who just enjoy playing this kind of content for entertainment. And so part of the work that Greg and I did in this area was looking at how this manifests into the way that people talk about and react to conversations, about gaming violence. And Greg's idea in the study was to, originally start asking the gamers about their experiences with gaming, what has been meaningful, and it was really quite striking to me that, before we ever mentioned in the actual survey instrument, we never delivered a question about violence. We never mentioned violence. People were already saying gaming doesn't cause violence. And I think that it just suggests to me that gamers are very cued into and attuned to this accusation. Right? And there has been a lot of work that's been done to indicate that, playing violent video games can instigate feelings of hostility and, increased momentary feelings of aggression and these kinds of things. And those don't necessarily translate then to real world behaviors that are problematic. And I think that's where a lot of this disconnect comes, is that academics talk about things and social scientists talk about things in this extremely particular way and with, very specific language that I think is very often, we're talking to ourselves. And then when the public gets that information, they're not reading it necessarily with the same level of precision that we are. And this, this kind of harkens back to the whole idea about, you can interpret some of my studies, as both problematic and encouraging ways, right? I mean, so it just depends on what you take out of it and what, how you interpret those results. And so that was actually the point of our study, was trying to determine how gamers talk to one another about some of these issues and how they're thinking about some of these issues with respect to, some of these very controversial and emotionally laden topics, and so that was the nature of that study, and that was why we did it, was to try to understand whether gamers are reacting in those ways. And I think for Greg and I both, we're both gamers, and I think we had an intuitive sense that was happening, but that study allowed us to sort of organize those thoughts in a more systematic way.
Right. The study, obviously, as you were saying, like, it talks about how gamers are defined both by people in the gaming world and people outside of it.
Right.
And then the part about gamers and non-gamers, and how, quote, non-gamers are often people who are gaming, who are in the world and are for some reason being gatekept or whatever. It reminded me of something I saw on Twitter a while back. And I think it was just like some numbered user, but something we all know exists, but I had never seen it in the wild, was someone posted about playing Mario, and this person's like, you call yourself a gamer, play a real game like Call of Duty that takes skill. And again, I thought, wow, you exist. I've never seen this before. Just so blatant. But it also made me think, Mario, the quintessential video game is now not considered real gaming. Yeah,
I know. There's been a lot of really good interpretive and critical work done on this topic, and that's kind of a different school of thought than the work that I'm doing. But Amanda Cote, for instance, is somebody who has done a lot of work in this area and kind of thinking about. Shira Chess is another scholar in this area who have done really incredible work talking about the way that these discourses, the way that people talk about this kind of thing, draws boundaries between what is legitimately gaming activity and not. And some of the work that I'm doing, we're investigating those topics too, and trying to understand, how does gaming shape your identity? How does it shape the way that you think about the community? Because of course, the identity of gamer is, a made up term. I mean, and what that means to you might be different than what it means to me. And it might be different than, what it means to this Redditor, right? I mean, so how people come to define or categorize themselves into that group, it is complex, and it's an interesting phenomenon because we see it being used as a point of contention and othering, that you are not a gamer because you don't play Call of Duty. Well, Call of Duty is only one game in a vast sea of gaming that, seems to be an unusual line to draw, right? I mean, if you're somebody who only plays JRPGs, then, does that make you not a gamer? Or, how do we negotiate these things? And so, there are other scholars who are much more articulate about that in their work than I'm able to be, because that's, the central nature of their work. But you're absolutely right that, that like the for instance, the division between casual gaming and core gaming is a huge point of contention within the gaming community. And even like, what is the gaming community? Like, are you part of the gaming community if you just play games? Maybe you don't think of yourself that way. It's complicated.
And maybe I read this wrong, but it was interesting to me that respondents said it's good to have another identity than just gamer, like to have hobbies outside of gaming, and maybe don't game excessively all the time. That might be a bad thing. But they also preferred games that required the most time investment.
Yeah, the thing that I think is just really telling about the nature of the responses that we got was how much people were responding to, even without us bringing them up, but responding to critiques of gamers, right? That idea that if you're a gamer, you're a person who only plays video games and you live in a basement and you never see the light of day and you're, socially isolated and all of these things. Gamers are aware of stereotypes about their group. And I think those kinds of comments are people trying to distance themselves and kind of assure us as the academic investigators in this situation, that they are not that kind of gamer, and that gamers are not represented, purely in the stereotypical way. And I just find that, fascinating, because we didn't even bring that up. We didn't bring up the idea that you have to play, compulsively or persistently to be a gamer, and they're reacting to that in the way that they're responding because they know that that is a critique that is levied at this group very often. And so, it's really an interesting thing, and it's kind of an identity protective mechanism is kind of how we've talked about it, that, people don't want their groups to be characterized in ways that are disparaging. People want to have a positive image of groups that they affiliate with and that are important to them. And I mean, certainly, again, as a gamer, I can that resonates with me.
So this is maybe an unfair and too broad of a question, but with the work you're doing, is there an overall goal? What are you trying to achieve with your research?
World domination. My work is really motivated by trying to understand the way that we can use video games to understand emotional processes and socialization processes. So I'm really interested in understanding how people become the people that they are. And part of the reason for that is if we can understand those mechanisms and those processes, then we can harness the power of these kinds of technologies to be able to help people thrive. And so that's ultimately, there is a positive spin to my work. I'm really interested in trying to understand how we can leverage these kinds of technologies to understand the human condition and to be able to improve people's lives. And I think that entertainment, there are definitely some times, I get the question, oh, you study video games, that's a real job. And well, this is part of our life, and this is what people are doing. This is how people are spending time, and there are potential harms of it, and there are potential benefits to it. And, trying to understand those differences can potentially help people to have fulfilling experiences and have these kinds of experiences that are enriching to their lives. And so if we can understand that more fully, then we can harness it more fully.
And are you allowed to tell me, what are you working on right now? What's coming up?
Right now, I'm working on some studies trying to understand more about the way that sexualized female characters influence people's feelings about themselves. So doing some experimental work in that area, and actually also working with just a couple of fantastic students and some great collaborators on trying to understand more about the way that the characters' personalities can influence the way that we feel about ourselves and how we come to incorporate that with our own self-concepts.
Cool. Well, people can check out more of Dr. Teresa Lynch at teresa-lynch.com. That's TERESA-LYNCH.com and chronoslaboratory.com. Dr. Teresa Lynch, thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Mark.